Welcome to our final ethics lecture video. Today we're going to talk about human rights, and we're going to, this isn't going to take us a long time, we're just going to kind of skim through a couple of ideas that will help us understand how to discuss this issue from a moral framework a little bit for us, okay? So we're going to look at two quotes here, one from two different documents talking about rights, and this discussion really kind of crosses over from a simple moral aspect into very much a political aspect, as we're going to talk about documents guaranteeing certain legal rights. And throughout our course, we have not really been concerned with the legal definitions and the concepts from a legal standpoint. We have been focused on morality. So this is going to be a little bit of a change for us this morning. So the first one here is from the Declaration of Independence. You see 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So if we look at what this is saying about human rights, is that human rights have an origin. They apply to everybody equally, and their origin is in the Creator of humanity. Okay, and so the origin of the rights that are held come from a source, and this source would be the one who is responsible for humanity. Okay, so that is the first one. The next is from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1, a document of the United Nations. This says all human beings are born free and all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now this is a little more vague here. It says humans have, they're born with freedom, and they have dignity and rights that are equal. It said they are endowed with reason and conscience, and that they should act in a certain way in this spirit of brotherhood. But it really doesn't tell us an origin. So that's one thing that is missing here, where this is an assertion without an origin, where the other assertion had an origin in whoever is responsible for humans. Now, what this will mean is that the Declaration of Independence appealed to an authority that was beyond the document itself. It appealed to a creator, whereas this declaration is standing on its own authority, appealing to either to reason or something, but not declaring it and making it the source of this freedom and dignity and rights is going to be tied up in the document itself without it appealing to an external source. So that's one of the main differences you're going to see in these two documents, is whether there is a source beyond the document or the writers of that document itself. Now I'm going to read you a little story about a girl named Siba. And as you're going to see the information on the screen about her. But I'm going to go ahead and read this to us, and then we'll talk about it. I was raised by my grandmother in Mali. And when I was a little girl, a woman my family knew came and asked if she could take me to Paris to care for her children. She told my grandmother that she would put me in school and that I would learn French. But when I came to Paris, I was not sent to school. I had to work every day. In her house, I did all the work. I cleaned the house, cooked the meals, cared for the children, and washed and fed the baby. Every day I started my work before 7 a.m. and finished about 11 p.m. I never had a day off. My mistress did nothing. She slept late and then watched television or went out. One day I told her I wanted to go to school. She replied she had not brought me to France to go to school, but to take care of her children. I was so tired and run down. I had problems with my teeth. Sometimes my cheek would swell and the pain would be terrible. Sometimes I had stomach aches, but when I was ill I still had to work. Sometimes when I was in pain I would cry, but my mistress would shout at me. She would often beat me. She would slap me all the time. She'd beat me with a broom with kitchen tools, or whip me with electric cable. Sometimes I would bleed. I still have marks on my body. Once, in 1992, I was late going to get the children from school. My mistress and her husband were furious with me and beat me and threw me out on the street. I didn't understand anything. I wandered on the street. After some time, her husband found me and took me back to the house. There they stripped me naked, tied my hands behind my back, and began to whip me with a wire attached to a broomstick. Both of them were beating me at the same time. I was bleeding a lot and screaming, but they continued to beat me. Then she rubbed chili pepper in my wounds and stuck it in my vagina. I lost consciousness. So this is a difficult story about this young girl who was lied to. Her family was lied to, and she was taken as basically a slave in France and in Paris. So, and I want you to note, this date mentioned was 1992. Now, that's when I graduated from high school. We like to think that slavery has been gone from our world, but it's not. And in fact, we'd like to think in a country like France or in an enlightened city like Paris that these things don't happen. But in 1992, as Seba's story shows us, that it did happen. So when we listen to Seba's story, we say this was wrong. This should not have happened to this girl. But why? Why do we think that? Why is it that we would say this idea of taking this girl's life and using it for your benefit like this and taking her freedom away is wrong? I want you to consider that. What makes this wrong? And this is where we talk about this concept of human rights. Now, we have a couple of definitions we're going to look at. The first is from Louis Poyman, who we have referenced a number of times throughout the semester. He defines a right as a claim against others that at the same time includes a liberty on one's own behalf. Okay, so it's when you can claim something that others owe you, and it's a freedom that you have. Okay, so J.L. Mackie, another important philosopher, wrote that a right in the most important sense is a conjunction of a freedom and a claim right. That is, if someone, A, has the moral right to do X, not only is he entitled to do X if he chooses, he's not morally required not to do X, but he is also protected in his doing of X. That is, others are morally required not to interfere or prevent him. Okay, so let's look at this without the letters, right? So if someone, let's say it's me, Wade, if Wade has the moral right to life, let's say, or to rather than that, let's say to speak. Let's say if I have the moral right to speak, then not only am I entitled to speak if I choose, I'm not morally required not to speak or to be silent. I have no moral requirement to be silent. I can speak if I choose. I'm not morally required to be silent. I'm also protected in my doing of X, or my speaking. So my speech then is protected. And others are morally required, what that means is that others are morally required not to interfere or prevent me. Okay? So, if we talk about this in terms of, say, speech, then I can speak if I want to. I don't have to. And if I choose to speak, then the requirement others have on me is that they don't interfere or stop me from speaking. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean in the terms of speech that they have to listen, but it just means they can't shut me up, is what that would mean if it's a right. Okay? And so talking about this in terms of some of the rights that maybe we understand would make sense. And so Poyman's definition is kind of right along with lines with that. It's less technical. A right is a claim against others that at the same time includes a liberty for yourself. So something like speech. My claim against others is that you don't interfere with my speech. My freedom is that I can speak if I want to. And that your obligation to me is that to not violate my rights means you don't interfere or prevent me from speaking. All right, let's look at universal basic rights defined by this Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations. And the first thing that we see here, we have a couple of pages we're going to look at. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood and circumstances beyond his control. The next slide here, the next part of that, motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in or out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. So let's look at this concept of rights compared to the rights, the type of right that we talked about in the first one, the other definition from these philosophers here, and talking about rights as a freedom and a claim right, okay? And so if we talk about something like speech as a right, which we have a little bit, then what is my obligation to you if you choose to exercise your right of speech? Well, my obligation to you is a negative responsibility, right? I have a responsibility to not interfere. So, if you choose to speak, my obligation, my moral obligation for you exercising your right is that I do not attempt to stop you from speaking or forcibly prevent you from speaking. With these type of rights that we see in this Universal Basic Rights Declaration here, these are positive rights. So, if you look here, there's a difference between the right to speak, the right to pursue happiness, some of the rights that we see in the United States that we have as rights based under our Constitution, the right to pursue happiness versus the universal basic rights discussed in this document. This says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and his family. Okay, so that would mean there's a right to have certain things like food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So, if I have a right to housing, then what obligation do you have to me? Well, housing would then be a positive right, so you would have to provide me with housing if it's a human right, if it's a basic right, according to this document. So if I do not have housing and I have a right to housing, then my claim right includes a positive claim on you, whereas something like speech does not have a positive, it's not a positive claim right. Your obligation to me is a negative one, not to interfere. If I am entitled to health care, or if I'm entitled to clothing, or to food, or to housing, then I can compel you to provide that. Whereas a right that is a negative right, like speech or pursuit of happiness, my obligation to someone else is to not stop them from exercising their right. In this kind of positive right, there's an obligation for me to provide something to them. So presumably, if I have food and you have a right to have food, then I have to provide some of that to you. That's part of my obligation to you for you exercising your rights. So it's a very different concept of rights that we see expressed in this document versus the concept like we see in the Constitution of the United States. And the same is for motherhood here. These are says special care and assistance for motherhood. So where does this have to be provided for? Well, the countries that agree to this document then would be obligating themselves to provide these. So the question is, can positive rights like this actually be human rights? And I'm going to say no, they can't be human rights. Because, first of all, most of humanity then didn't have these rights. There was no guarantee of housing or healthcare or social services. There was no such thing as social services for the ancient world, and especially for Stone Age people that are some of the earliest humans. This idea of social services, so they didn't have this right. So it can't be a human right there. Because one, it hasn't been available for all humans, and then the whole question of whether positive rights could be human rights as well. So if you were a human and there was no other person around to provide you with those rights, if you have negative rights, you can still exercise them, right? But if you have positive rights, they can't be exercised alone because someone has to provide you with stuff. Okay. Now, if these things were discussed as you have the right to pursue a standard of living, to try to, no one can stop you from looking for food or trying to provide and raise your own food, or provide your own clothing, or provide housing for yourself, or seek medical care and social services, then that would be different, because then what would our obligation be? Well, not to stop someone who is trying to provide food for themselves, or clothing, or housing. But as these are stated as positive rights, then you have a claim right on presumably other things that other people have, so that you can also have certain things. And so positive rights really cannot be human rights, not in a sense of something that all humans are endowed with. Now, they may be granted by political organizations. So one of the things that our Constitution in the United States focuses on is the idea that these rights don't come from the United States. They come from the Creator. They come from the deity that is responsible for humans' existence. So that means if they come from the deity, then the government can't take it away. These kind of human rights that we see in the UN document, though, are granted by the agreement of the country to sign this document. So if the country decides not to no longer hold to these, then, well, these basic rights then disappear, because they're not grounded in anything else besides that the country said, hey, yeah, we think these are good, and we're going to provide them. But if we said, oh, you know what, I don't think that, it's getting really expensive to provide clothing for people, or housing, or medical care. They don't really need the medical care, so we're just going to revise this document. We're going to remove medical care from it, and medical care and necessary social services will no longer be part of universal basic rights. So rights then can change. Whereas the negative rights that are provided by the virtue of being human, according to the Declaration of Independence, would not be something that was created by the Declaration of Independence. It was simply recognized by that, whereas these positive rights here for the United Nations are created by the document itself. So that's a bit of a difference when we look at rights. So Poyman argues, or he talks about some limiting factors on rights, and he says he points to Elizabeth Volgast, who argues that rights language distorts the moral domain. So rights language tends to transform every relationship into a legalistic relationship. And he notes here, healthcare institutions often have patient's bill of rights, and so if you go into a facility, you'll often see your rights as a patient here, and it talks about these different timely care, people who care, whatever these things are that they have, these rights you have as being a patient. And what Volgast says is that often what patients need are trusting relationships rather than rights language, because this turns everything into a legal discussion. Oh, I had a right not to be sitting here hungry, and now I'm going to sue you because of that. And so we have an overly litigious society where everybody wants to sue everybody else. And instead of saying, you know what, we've got someone who really cares for your well-being and wants to do the best thing for you, no, we have this kind of checklist of things that we have to say or whatever instead, and that might not be the best care. So the reality is, especially if, say, you have someone struggling with addiction, they may have a right, according to a patient's bill of rights, to receive, let's say, medicine, treat pain management medicine, right, or the painkillers. Maybe we've got a big issue with opioids now. Maybe they have a right to that, but maybe that would be bad for them to actually, if they've got a problem with addiction, to be given narcotics or opioids. Maybe that would be a bad thing for them. So what they need is not a right to that, but they need a caring, trusting relationship with a healthcare provider to help them get better and not worse. And so this whole discussion of rights, all these rights you supposedly have by these organizations may not make society better. They may make it worse. And going on here, it says, the rights language suggests that the same self-interested model that governs consumer relationships of impersonal economic forces governs all our relationships and turns us into economic atoms rather than recognizing the special place of personal fiduciary relationships. When we have to formalize behavior into a legal right, we have passed from a situation of communal and personal trust to an impersonal, bureaucratic, and legalistic society. Now, a fiduciary responsibility or relationship, if you have a responsibility to look out for the best interest of another person, that's a fiduciary relationship or responsibility. So, if you have a healthcare surrogate, or if you have an investment advisor, let's say that you have investments, they have a fiduciary responsibility to you. If they have that responsibility, or someone who manages a trust or something like that, then they have a legal responsibility to seek your best interest, not their own. So if I sold stocks, let's say, and you had your retirement money with me, I could churn your account. I could say, well, let's buy this stock today and buy another one tomorrow. Each time it generates a commission for me. And I'm not looking out for your best interest. I'm generating commissions to make money for me. That would violate the fiduciary responsibility, because my responsibility to look out for your best interest means that the decisions I make with your money have to be decisions that put you in a better position, or at least try to, and it's not ones that simply put me in a better position. So that's that issue of trust. And if we have these relationships of trust, knowing that I am looking out for your best interests rather than my own best interests, that's the fiduciary responsibility. And we lose that with rights language. When we have to make everything into a legal right, then we become a bureaucratic and legalistic society rather than a trusting and community-based society. Just like you may think, hopefully your parents look out for your best interests because they care about you, right? It's not that you just can maybe force and say, well, you have an obligation to provide this for me or to do that for me. You have a loving, trusting relationship here. We lose that, according to Volgast, when we have all of this rights language everywhere. And I think there's a good point to that. We do see everything becoming more bureaucratic and legalistic, and that does not necessarily lead to a better society. So anyway, that's our discussion on rights. It's just a topic I want you to have a little bit of reference with. Thank you for the class, and thank you for going through all of the lectures, and wish you the best.